supporters condemned as traitors to the state. He also, of course, had the command against Mithridates switched once again from Marius to himself. Now it was Marius who was on the run, escaping and finding refuge in North Africa. Having allied himself firmly with the Optimate faction, Sulla now pushed through several bills whose intent was to solidify their control and curb the power of the tribunes in popular assemblies. This was the first time that a Roman had marched on Rome using a Roman army against his own country, and it set a horrible precedent. Ironically, Sulla's act was only made possible by Marius's earlier actions in making armies loyal to their generals rather than to the state. With his dominance reestablished and the Senate seemingly in control at Rome, Sulla took his army and left for the east to campaign against Mithridates. Back in Rome, meanwhile, opposition to Sulla coalesced around a politician named Cinna, who allied himself with Marius. By appealing to Marius's veterans, slaves, and disgruntled Italians, the two men raised an army, and at its head, Marius marched on Rome. After a brief siege, he captured the city, killed one of the consuls, and embarked on a bloody purge of his enemies, who were unconstitutionally executed without a trial. Their property was confiscated, and their severed heads were put on display in the Forum on the Rostra. Marius now contrived to have himself appointed for the year 86 BC to a record 7th consulship, and predictably had the Mithridates command transferred from Sulla to himself. He did not enjoy his triumph for long, however, since only a few days after taking office, the 70-year-old Marius became ill. He fell into a delirium in which he feverishly imagined that he was leading the army against Mithridates, and thus, dreaming of the command that had been denied him, he died only 17 days into his 7th consulship. Rome was still controlled by Marius's followers, who began to raise forces with which to oppose Sulla. In the east, Sulla half-heartedly pursued the war against Mithridates, but what he really needed to do was return to Rome and reassert his dominance. Accordingly, in 85 BC, he hastily made a treaty with Mithridates, whereby the Pontic king paid a token fine, surrendered a bit of territory, and promised to be a friend to Rome in the future. The treaty with Mithridates illustrates quite clearly, if any further proof were needed, how politicians' private interests were now driving Roman foreign policy. By leaving the ambitious king unbeaten, it also all but ensured that there would be further conflicts with him, and that the East would remain unstable. But none of this was of concern to Sulla at that moment. So in 83 BC, he set sail for Italy, bringing 5 legions of his troops along with him. For a second time, Sulla marched at the head of a Roman army against his own capital city. In a battle just outside the city gates, Sulla defeated his enemies. Some of these, such as the son of Marius, committed suicide, while others fled to remote provinces. By 81 BC, the various opponents were vanquished, and Sulla was once more on top. This time, he was determined to settle affairs to his liking with such finality that no opposition would be left to ever thwart him again. He had the Senate officially endorse all of his previous actions, bestow upon him a new name, Sulla Felix, or Lucky Sulla, and finally, and most significantly, had himself appointed dictator. This gave him unlimited power to do anything he wanted. In the past, the office of dictator had been accompanied by a strict term limit of no more than 6 months. Sulla, however, had himself made dictator without any time limit. He claimed that his only goal was to restore the Republic and to return Rome to its old-fashioned virtue. To achieve these ends, he settled on a 2-part strategy. The simpler and more direct component was to eliminate anyone who might be a threat or who might disagree with him. This was accomplished via a mechanism known as prescriptions. These consisted of publishing lists of people who were declared outlaws. Their citizenship was revoked, and they had a reward placed on their heads. Anyone could lawfully kill such prescribed persons and claim the reward. The property of the prescribed was seized and auctioned by the state. Sulla filled the prescription lists with the supporters of Marius, political opponents, wealthy people whose property he wished to seize, and just anyone he thought might pose a danger to him. Supposedly, thousands were killed, including 15 ex-consuls, 90 senators, and 2,600 equestrians. It was truly a bloodbath. The second stage of Sulla's plan was to implement a series of reforms that would allegedly restore the Republic to its traditional state, one in which the Senate and nobles had complete control. To do this, he increased the power of the upper classes and Senate, reorganizing the voting assemblies to give them more weight, granting the Senate greater control over proposing and approving legislation, enlarging the number of senators to 600, preventing anyone from holding offices consecutively, as Marius had done, and finally, curtailing the power of the tribunes, limiting what the tribunician veto could be used for, and effectively making the tribunate a dead-end job by prohibiting ex-tribunes from holding any subsequent offices. Sulla wanted to bring back the old-style republic and tried to turn back the clock to his vision of what it had been. Having reorganized the republic to his satisfaction, Sulla resigned from the dictatorship, withdrew to his country estate in Campania, began to write his memoirs, and indulged in his favorite pastimes of hunting and drinking. He plainly envisioned for himself a long, comfortable retirement, but it was not to be. Much like Marius, a short time after achieving his peak of power, Sulla fell ill, and he died after only a year of retirement. He was given a particularly elaborate funeral that featured such novelties as 2 life-size statues made out of aromatic frankincense and cinnamon, which were burned on his pyre. His ashes were laid to rest in a tomb that bore an inscription that he himself had selected. It read, "No one ever did more to help his friends or to harm his enemies." Marius and Sulla were the first in a sequence of pairs of famous men who struggled for dominance at Rome during the late Republic. Their actions did much to undermine the institutions and customs of the Republic and to cause its destruction. It's an interesting debate whether the career of Marius or Sulla was more harmful to the state. Doing so also reveals much about the flaws and weaknesses of the Republic. Let's draw up a list of the worst actions of each man and attempt to see whose actions were ultimately most harmful. We'll begin with Marius. He was a new man who challenged the aristocrats within the constraints of Republican institutions in a way that was certainly unprecedented and that broke many long-established customs. Perhaps the first of these was his betrayal of the patron-client system by running for the consulship against the wishes of his patron Metellus. He also eliminated the traditional wealth requirement for military service, creating armies loyal to their commanders rather than the state. He broke precedent by being elected to the consulship 7 times, 5 of them consecutively, thereby monopolizing the chief magistracy and denying others the opportunity to hold it. He bypassed the Senate and used tribunes to get the command against Jugurtha granted to him by the people's voting assemblies. He was the first to use troops against fellow Romans when he suppressed Saturninus, although this was at the request of the Senate. He murdered his political opponents and marched on Rome, although only after Sulla had done it first. What about Sulla? Some of the key negative actions were that he too betrayed the patron-client relationship, taking credit for the capture of Jugurtha away from his patron, Marius. He frequently subordinated the good of the state to his personal gain, as when he made a poor treaty with Mithridates in order to return to Rome. And he manipulated the tribunate to gain the command against Mithridates. He was the first Roman to march on Rome with an army. He used proscriptions on an unprecedented scale to murder his political opponents. And finally, he made himself dictator for life. Which of these acts do you think is the worst? Which do you think set the most harmful precedent? Does intent matter in how we evaluate them? Marius was always clearly out for his own benefit, whereas Sulla, during his dictatorship, claimed that he was acting for the good of the state. What's more harmful? To do something first or to do it more egregiously? Marius first used troops at Rome, but Sulla did it later far more violently and without the consent of the Senate. Much of Marius's career had the effect of shifting power to the people, whereas many of Sulla's acts increased the power of the aristocracy. Does this matter? There are no clear answers to these questions, and I'll leave it to you to form your own opinions regarding them. What is certain is that Sulla and Marius mark the end of the rough equilibrium in the Republic among the Senate, the people, and the magistrates, as well as of consensus within the ruling aristocracy at Rome. With Marius and Sulla, the Republic could no longer accommodate the private ambitions of its generals.